Europe, on the eve of World War I, a civilization at the peak of its power and glory. Winston Churchill wrote, "The old world in its sunset was fair to see." Fair for some, perhaps, but not for all. Elaborate systems of alliance have divided Europe into two armed camps, and the general staff spend their days planning the war they are sure will come. Across the Atlantic, the United States is a dynamic continental nation, a potential world power as yet unwilling to play a great power role, its people still determined to remain aloof from the politics of Europe. Its President, Woodrow Wilson, speaks of a new social age, a new era of human relationships. His Secretary of State predicts, "There will be no war as long as I live." But war came, to Europe, to America, to Woodrow Wilson.
June 28, 1914. Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a pro-Serbian nationalist. The European time bomb explodes. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and one declaration of war leads to another and another, until most of Europe plunges into the inferno. Both sides predict victory within a few months. President Wilson proclaims American neutrality and appeals to his countrymen to be neutral in thought as well as in action.
Thank God that we are not involved. Every man who truly loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality.
The American public approves. Europe is 3,000 miles away. George Washington's doctrine of isolation from Europe's affairs has succeeded for over 100 years. But then news arrives of German atrocities in Belgium. The German chancellor calls an international treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality a scrap of paper, and German armies invade, leveling cities and shooting unarmed civilians. Committees are formed for the relief of Belgian war victims, and former President Theodore Roosevelt denounces Wilson's policy of neutrality as a cowardly denial of American principles. But most Americans remain opposed to going to war.
They might have stayed that way if the Germans had not resorted to unrestricted submarine warfare, a tactic designed to break the supremacy of the British Navy. The Germans declare a war zone around the British Isles for all ships. The German embassy publishes a warning in New York newspapers that transatlantic travel is unsafe. A few days later, as the British liner Lusitania nears the Irish coast, it is torpedoed by a German submarine. More than 1,100 lives are lost. American public opinion turns decisively against Germany.
Now, President Wilson confronts a problem as old as the Republic: the rights of neutral Americans when Europe is at war. In 1916, he runs for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war."
I know that you are depending on me to keep this nation out of war. So far, I have done so, and I pledge you my word that, God helping me, I will, if it is possible.
Germany has promised there will be no repetition of the Lusitania sinking.
During the next few months, Wilson attempts to play the role of peacemaker. He tries to convene a peace conference. When this fails, he asks both proposals for peace. When this fails, he offers a program of his own.
February 1917. Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans calculate they can win the war before the United States can intervene. Within 2 months, 6 American vessels are sent to the bottom by German submarines. At the same time, it is learned that Germany has proposed an anti-American alliance with Mexico. Peace is no longer possible. Wilson breaks relations with Germany and asks Congress for a declaration of war. It is the war to end all wars.
It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into a war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. Civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. We shall fight for the ultimate peace of the world. The world must be made safe for democracy.
For the first time in history, American troops embark for Europe, and Americans enter a European war. The American soldiers are greeted by joyous mobs who pray these fresh troops can end the years of stalemate. And so they do, but only after learning a terrible truth. Modern war. Mass slaughter on battlefields as desolate as the moon. Landmines and poison gas and long-range artillery. Machine guns and tanks, and death dropping from the skies. Men and cities erased from the earth.
In Russia, the slaughter becomes unbearable. A revolution overthrows the Tsar's government. Soon thereafter, the Bolsheviks take power, led by Nikolai Lenin, who immediately removes Russia from the war, releasing 1 million German troops to fight on the Western Front.
But even as the Allies desperately resist the German assault, Wilson puts forward a 14-point proposal for a just and lasting settlement to be enforced by a world organization, a League of Nations. All the bloodshed will be for naught if such a war can ever happen again.
The Western Front holds. Strengthened by 500,000 fresh American troops, the Allies mount 5 crushing offensives. Germany is close to collapse. A revolution overthrows the Kaiser, and the new government signs an armistice.
All quiet on the Western Front. And in the cities of the world, wild joy. It is the end of horror, the beginning of peace, the dawning of a new age. December 1918, President Wilson arrives in France to attend the Paris Peace Conference. He's greeted as a conquering hero, a great world leader who will forever put an end to war. He goes in spite of angry criticism that the president should not be out of the country, taking along a delegation consisting mainly of close personal advisors. It does not include even one member of the Senate. Wilson's party has just lost the congressional elections, but Wilson gambles everything on bringing back a treaty so favorable, the Senate must accept it. "27 nations send delegates to the conference, but the crucial decisions are made by the Council of 4. Wilson, Italian Premier Orlando, French Premier Clemenceau, and British Prime Minister Lloyd George. They meet behind closed doors, appearing in public only for ceremonious picture-taking. Their announcements are bland. Journalists complain this is inconsistent with Wilson's doctrine of open covenants openly arrived at, and rumors spread of a sellout. In fact, Wilson proves to be a tough negotiator. He insists that a detailed covenant for the League of Nations be included in the treaty, and writes much of it himself. June 28, 1919. In the Great Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the delegates assemble to sign the Treaty of Peace. Few are satisfied. All have been forced to compromise. Germany and her allies are required to accept responsibility for all war damages suffered by their opponents. But the treaty includes Wilson's cherished League of Nations. The League would make adjustments. The League would enforce the peace. Wilson comes home. To obtain popular support and Senate approval of the treaty, he discovers that hostility to the League and other parts of the treaty is much greater than he had realized. Senator Lodge, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
It is just as undesirable to have Europe interfere in American affairs now as Mr. Monroe thought it was in 1823.
Against the advice of his doctors, Wilson embarks on a cross-country tour designed to force Senate acceptance of the treaty. He warns his countrymen that rejection will lead to another world war within a generation.
I would like to get together the boys who fought in the war, and I would stand up before them and say, boys, I told you that this was a war against wars, but I am obliged to come to you in mortification and shame and say, I have not been able to fulfill the promise. You are betrayed.
Wilson makes 37 speeches in 22 days, traveling nearly 10,000 miles, one man pushing himself beyond the limits of human endurance to save the whole framework of the peace he fought so hard to construct. The pressure is too much. Wilson collapses and is rushed back to Washington. Soon, one side of his body is paralyzed.
November 1919. The treaty is defeated in the Senate by a vote of 53 to 38. The United States will not join the League of Nations. The United States will return to the isolationism of the past. Woodrow Wilson, his health destroyed and his days numbered, broods out the rest of his term, a broken, embittered invalid.
They have shamed us in the eyes of the world.
Geneva, 1920. The League of Nations meets without United States participation. The delegates face a staggering task. Gone is the old sense of order and stability, the certainty of progress and man's ability to control his destiny. The memory of the nightmare just ended lingers on. Has peace really come, or is it, as some say, still only an armistice, merely a pause in the terrible slaughter? Throughout the 1920s, Europe is engaged in a feverish search for security.
The war has left European victors and vanquished both deeply in debt. Americans insist their former allies repay huge loans. The Allies insist that Germany pay them enormous war reparations. France occupies the Ruhr Valley when Germany defaults on her payments. German workers stop production in protest. The debate over payments poisons all attempts to end the animosities of war. Border disputes abound. There are riots and a series of little wars. Bolsheviks have already seized power briefly in Hungary and caused disorders in Germany and elsewhere.
In Italy, a former socialist pamphleteer becomes dictator. Benito Mussolini, a rabble-rouser supported by a private army of fascist blackshirts. It is both a rejection of the old order and a reaction against Bolshevism, extremism of the right to match extremism of the left. In 1923, an obscure and embittered Austrian named Adolf Hitler leads a private army of hoodlums and malcontents in an attempted putsch in Munich, Germany. To many, Hitler seems a ridiculous figure, his associates beneath contempt. He is arrested and sent to jail, and, it is assumed, to permanent oblivion. But in jail, Hitler writes a frightening blueprint of terror to come. In 1924, Lenin dies, and Joseph Stalin takes control of the Russian Revolution. Stalin, the dictator, drives the Russian people relentlessly in the pursuit of industrialization. He believes war with capitalism is inevitable.
American foreign policy is depicted as a locked vault, guarded by the Secretary of State himself. In fact, Charles Evans Hughes is an internationalist who favored joining the League of Nations. Early in the 20s, he astonishes a naval disarmament conference in Washington by proposing that those present scrap part of their navies and build no new capital ships for 10 years. The conference seeks to restrain growing Japanese ambitions in Asia. A treaty is signed supporting the territorial integrity of China.
In 1928, Secretary of State Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Briand negotiate a treaty outlawing war. Eventually, 60 nations sign. There are no provisions for enforcement.
1931. The boom years of the 1920s are now a grim memory. The nation, the entire world, is gripped by a disastrous depression. At the League of Nations, another disarmament conference convenes. But even as the delegates assemble, the Japanese launch an all-out attack on Manchuria. China appeals to the League for help. The Japanese army takes over and establishes a puppet government. The United States refuses to recognize the regime and reaffirms its support of China's sovereignty. A report commissioned by the League brands the Japanese as aggressors. Japan's response is to withdraw from the organization.
1933, another staggering blow. Economic collapse in Germany brings Adolf Hitler to power. His program, expansion of German boundaries, subjugation or extermination of non-Germanic peoples, the establishment of a fascist empire. He is a hypnotic orator, a hate-spewing spellbinder who stages massive propaganda rallies. He repudiates the Treaty of Versailles and announces plans to rearm. By year-end, Germany too withdraws from the League.
With the rise of Hitler, the Peace of Versailles is dead. The search for security has failed. A new generation of aggressors has set the world on the path toward war. There is still time to stop them, if the democracies will act. But in England and France, the memory of World War I is still too strong, and Americans remain preoccupied with the Great Depression.
A congressional committee under the chairmanship of Senator Nye launches an investigation of U.S. involvement in World War I and concludes it was caused by American business interests. It is a simplistic but popular theme. The result, the Neutrality Act of 1935, prohibiting shipments of arms and munitions to all belligerents in any way, making no distinction between the aggressor and his victim. Senator Bone of Washington.
I think the resolution we have just passed will do more to prevent this country getting into war and to keep our boys out of the clutches of the war-maddened and crazy rulers of Europe than anything that we could have done.
Italian dictator Mussolini, encouraged by Japan's successful aggression in China, invades Ethiopia.
The Ethiopians fight bravely against the mechanized Italian army, and Emperor Haile Selassie goes to Geneva to personally plead to the League of Nations for the life of his country. Once again, the League fails the test. The new U.S. neutrality law, in fact, favors Mussolini by denying Ethiopia the arms it desperately needs.
1936, a fateful year. Civil war erupts in Spain. The fascist powers supply arms to the nationalists, the Soviet Union to the loyalists. Spain becomes the tragic testing ground for new and even more terrible weapons of modern war. Hitler sends German troops into the Rhineland, a region demilitarized by the 1925 Locarno Treaty.
It is a moment of supreme tragedy. The democracies still possess superior force, but they fail to use it. Hitler concludes they will go to any length to avoid war. A nationwide poll asks Americans whether their country should fight if war comes to Europe. 95% say no. Anti-war advertisements appear in national magazines.
I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gasped lungs.
In the 1936 campaign, President Roosevelt echoes their feelings.
That is beyond my power. I hate war.
That same year, Germany and Italy formed the Rome-Berlin Axis.
It is followed by the Anti-Comintern Pact, which soon links both nations to Japan.
1937, a new year and new conquests. Japan declares a new order in Asia and crosses the Manchurian border for a full-scale invasion of China. At last, Roosevelt feels compelled to speak out. He suggests the quarantine of international lawlessness, but the public's response is negative.
December. Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. gunboat Panay on peaceful patrol in the Yangtze River. Survivors are strafed as they go ashore. Americans are shocked, outraged, and the Japanese apologize, but the two nations are now on a collision course.
1938, Adolf Hitler's turn. Supremely confident, he sends Nazi troops into Austria to put down a manufactured crisis. Austria is absorbed into his Third Reich. There are diplomatic protests.
Czechoslovakia is next. The pretext? The German population in the Sudetenland. Hitler demands the entire area. The Czechs refuse. Some argue that Hitler's demands are legitimate, that peace will come when all Germans are united. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, a sincere man who abhors war, flies to Munich to meet Hitler. They are joined by French Premier Daladier and Benito Mussolini. No Czech representatives are allowed to attend their meetings.
1 a.m., September 30th, 1938. The four powers sign a document providing for the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, to be completed in 10 days. Chamberlain returns to London and announces he has concluded an honorable agreement.
Yesterday afternoon, I had a long talk with Herr Hitler. It was a frank talk, but it was a friendly one. And I feel satisfied now that each of us fully understands what is in the mind of the other.
In an immortal phrase, Chamberlain tells his people, "I believe it is peace in our time."
Peace in our time. 6 months later, Hitler occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement is already dead. Hitler protests he only wants peace, but by now it is a bad joke. He demands more territory, this time in Poland. Further appeasement is hopeless. Britain and France announce they will go to war if Poland is attacked. August 1939. A terrified Europe receives another shock. The Soviet and Nazi foreign ministers, Molotov and von Ribbentrop, sign a non-aggression pact, and all hope for peace is lost. Suddenly, the fascists and communists are enemies no more. A secret protocol divides Poland between them. Within a week, German armies enter Poland as German planes blitz its cities. World War II has begun.
June 1940. Nazi armies sweep through the lowlands and into Paris. The American people are stunned, completely unprepared for such a display of power. The Nazi menace no longer seems so remote. The German Air Force begins its assault across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain is on. If England breaks, Hitler has conquered Europe.
William Allen White, a famous Kansas editor, organizes the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. He tells his country